Thank you all for being here. And my name is Stefan Fuchs. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at TU Munich, but this work is basically dating back to my time at the University of Auckland, where we had a collaboration with the Bauhaus-Universität in Weimar, and we were conducting interviews with regulators or people who are involved in drafting and computerizing building regulations. So why is that relevant? Well, if we look at automatic compliance checking, I've got an example here of Solibri, which is a model checker, but you can also implement some rules to do actual compliance checks. You can parameterize your rules, so there's already a lot of functionality given, so you can basically put your regulation in there and execute them. But there are some problems that the relations that are given, it's kind of a black box, you don't know how exactly they are implementing them, and the rules is in their specific format, so you can't change much on there. And there is the problem that if we're looking at building regulations, they are changing regularly. If we are looking at IBC, there are, for IBC 2018, there are 5-6 different versions. They have a regular code cycle of 3 years, where the codes will be updated, so you have to keep your rules also up to date. Similar in New Zealand, if you look at the structural regulations, since 1992, we are at Amendment 21, and similarly for energy, we have already over 5 editions where there were bigger changes to the regulations, and that all has to be kept up to date. That's why a conventional approach or idea is we have to have some representation, some external representation, which you can keep up to date. Here an example from the Cape and Coast from Korea, but we also have race, what we hear later, for example, and many more representations. And the idea is that we are translating our regulations in such a representation, and that representation can be consumed by your compliance checker. And if you make updates to the representation, the compliance checker should, in the best case, not need any updates. Then there was there was a similar approach from the US, where they proposed we could even structure the regulations already having a structured format, having requirement units, having semantic information elements, and if we, for example, do something like that during the drafting process, we could generate the natural language automatically. So the question that I asked is that actually feasible? Is it useful to do that? So we were conducting interviews, which we already presented last year, and where our journal paper is in production, so that will soon be out. And there we were talking to regulators, asking them if what is their opinion on such formal representations. Is it useful to create such formal representations during the drafting process? Is it feasible for them? Is it worth the effort? And in this paper, we're looking on the subset of those interviews. We did code the interview, the interviews were around 60 minutes. We were transcribing them, analyzing them, coding them in vivo, and then we had one big block of interview codings, which was about automatic compliance checking. Well, it's kind of rooted in the role that the people the interviewees had. We had a few that were just involved in drafting, but it was very difficult to actually find those people who are doing the drafting, so many were just involved somehow with the drafting, or were more like on the computerization of the regulations. So you see there's a big group of ACC, so we collected a lot of data and a lot of insights also of those different ACC systems that were created in those different countries. Like in Singapore, we got some information about implementation of Cornet X. Estonia, we'll hear in the next talk. And Switzerland, there was a research project on fire protection regulations and how you can check them with BIM, and so on. So the focus of that paper was what progress towards ACC systems were connected to those agencies where the interviews were from, and how were they connected, how did they play together, how did they inform each other. Also to mention the organizations, we got quite a good collection, different from government, also from industry, from research, so it's a quite diverse group. And I would like to report some of the lessons learned, what we've seen, what was in common of those approaches. So we've seen that most approaches started with analyzing the regulations, seeing which of the regulations are feasible to be implemented. So most of the countries took more of a pragmatic approach, seeing is it worth to request the information, the amount of information from the modelers, is it worth to implement the checks for what we get out of it. Also, there was a focus on the reusability of the components, looking into can we reuse our checks, which checks can be used for what different regulations. And while most of the approaches didn't use specific formal representations, so that's not a common practice, but still we've seen some kind of flow charts, some kind of charts were usually used to communicate, to capture the requirements, and then pass on that flow charts to your programmers who would then most of the time just code the checks and write them down. Also what we've seen was quite a shift towards performance-based codes in most of the countries that we were speaking of, where also there were some points that were raised of the benefits that brings, but also that kind of if you don't have measurable values in your performance space, if you don't have performance criteria well specified, then that brings problems for the computability and for compliance checking. And similarly, it was raised that you should keep a clear connection between your performance criteria and a prescriptive path that you could go alternatively. Another common scheme that we've seen was about the visualization and the transparency of the checks. So most of the tools had some IFC viewer integrated, some tools integrated that you could see what were the checks, why did those fail, how was it checked, and potentially if it's more subjective requirements that could not yet be integrated, they would still have the requirements there in the tool, and you could have a human-in-the-loop approach to check if, to manually check based on the IFC model, does it comply or does it not comply. This can also help for other types of uncertainty, where some have proposed to have the human more in the loop if the checks are uncertain, so having more like a traffic light systems, using heat maps for degrees of compliance for more complex parts. For example, protrusion of the balcony was mentioned in that context. And this type of also, they noted the benefit that you can collect data, see the decisions that the humans make with the tool, collect the reasoning behind those decisions, and potentially in future you can also automate things like that during using AI. Then to the collaboration, we've seen in Singapore there was a strong collaboration from industry, from the ACC developers within the governments, within the different agencies, which is also important, and also having direct connections to the regulators, which simplifies getting clarifications if something is unsure. And they mentioned things like the gross floor area was defined differently in some parts of the regulations, so things like that can also be fixed if there's a close communication. Similarly, in Estonia, it was mentioned that it was difficult to, since it was mostly one agency, it's difficult to implement rules coming from another agency, so that can bring problems. And also in Belgium and Switzerland, we heard that it was beneficial if the ACC developers are actually integrated into the development of the regulations to give feedback on the computability of the regulations. Does it make sense to formulate the regulations as they propose to do, and can we actually implement that in a compliance checker? So to summarize, collaboration and communication between all those stakeholders is key. Visualization and transparency is very important. One proposal was having more of a perspective change, because some regulations might be not yet automatable, but the bar is shifting with time, so we might get to automate more and more. The more data we collect, the more the technical development progresses. And finally, I think there's a good future direction for research to work more on subjective and performance-based codes. Thank you very much.